Hello, I'm Deborah Bronstad, and today I'm here to share with you about the common symptoms of grief. I really don't like the word symptoms when we talk about grief because grief is not an illness or a disorder. Grief really is the natural human response to loss, whether it's losing a connection to a person or losing the something we've depended on and trusted would always be there for us. Grief in all of its manifestations takes us into a healing mode to help us recover from loss. Unfortunately, because it's so painful, we're often tempted to skip the process. A natural part of grief is reflecting on the relationship that was lost or the thing that we depended on. I guess when I say that, I'm talking about if we're grieving the loss of a home or a job or a community. Those are some other places where we do grieve. Um, and so, whether it's a loved one or something like that, we tend to reflect on our history with those things and how they met our needs, positive memories, negative memories. That's all part of the normal process of grief. But it does take energy to reflect on that, and emotional energy and physical energy, even. And it can take us away from the things, the attention, and to the things that we do in our everyday life. Well, the experience of grief is different for every person, and even for the same person suffering grief at different times in their life, it can be different. A lot of times you hear somebody say, I know how you feel. But the reality is, I can never know how you feel as you're dealing with your grief. At best, I know how I felt when I was dealing with my grief. So, today I'd like to share with you some common symptoms, or I prefer manifestations of grief. And we see them in 5 different realms, and that would be the physical manifestations, the emotional manifestations, cognitive manifestations of grief, spiritual manifestations, and social manifestations. So let's start with the physical. Physically, when we're grieving, we may experience disturbances in sleep patterns, fatigue, just physical fatigue or restlessness. Sometimes people feel nausea and may even actually vomit. Um, there can be pain and tension in the body. Uh, there is evidence through research of a decreased immune response in the immune system. Uh, and it also can be hard to stop activity, especially if that activity is distracting you from the pain. And so that so for some people, they become more active when they're grieving, but for others, they become less active. And so inactivity can also be a manifestation of grief. And again, the same person could manifest these opposite type um, symptoms at different times in their same grieving process. Um, Another thing that can happen physically is some unusual clumsiness. People are more prone to accidents after a major loss. So those are some physical manifestations of grief. Let's look at some of the emotional manifestations. Crying, that's one of the most obvious ones. Sadness, fear and anxiety, numbness and or emptiness, loneliness, anger, helplessness, irritability, a sense of observing yourself, kind of that something seems unreal, guilt, reduced confidence, reduced self-esteem, lowered interest in things that you previously enjoyed. Those are all some emotional manifestations. And, if you were struggling with any emotional difficulties before your loss, oftentimes they become exacerbated because our ability to just tolerate some of these emotions is lessened when we're dealing with grief. Some of the cognitive manifestations can include slower thinking or processing, difficulty making decisions, some mental confusion, daydreams or flashbacks, and even talking to the deceased loved one. And so those are some of the ways that we can be affected cognitively when we're grieving. Spiritually, there's a whole host of symptoms as well. We can experience a sense of closeness to God when we're grieving, or or at different times in our own process, we can experience a sense of distance from God. We can experience anger at God. We can experience being isolated from our spiritual community, or even uh, people report sensing their loved one's presence after a loss. So those are the spiritual manifestations. And then socially, there's another list here of things that we can experience socially. That would be isolation or withdrawal. And that can happen two ways. Sometimes people in our life don't know how to comfort us, or they don't know what to say, and they kind of back off or may avoid us. But on the other hand, sometimes we ourselves withdraw from social situations when we're grieving. There can be a preoccupation with your own needs, your own feelings, to the exclusions of others. And this can obviously affect your friendships and relationships. There can be increased stress in your marriage. There can be a decreased interest in sex, and also impatience with others, maybe even in your own family, who experience the same loss but aren't having the same manifestations of the grief as you are. Some people are more expressive, some people are less expressive in their grieving styles, and so that can create some tension in a family as far as another social manifestation of grief. So as we look today at 5 different realms where we experience grief: in the physical realm, emotional, cognitive, spiritual, and social realms, that grief affects us in a lot of different ways. And no two people are going to experience it the same way. So as you deal with grief in your life, I want to encourage you to just give grace to yourself for what you're dealing with, as well as grace to others to deal with grief in the way that they need to. Um, and as always, if I can help you with that process, I have some grief recovery outreach programs coming up that you can call me for more information. Call the number on your screen. As well as I also work one-on-one with people to help them through grief recovery and taking the specific necessary steps toward completing their grief, so that they can, so you can keep the positive memories without being hijacked by the memories that cause pain, or regret, or guilt, or anything like that. So I look forward to hearing from you and walking with you in your grief journey.